The carriage turned onto the gravel path at 3:20 in the afternoon, and Harriet Comstock noticed, before anything else, that no one had come out to meet her. Not a housekeeper, not a groundskeeper, not even a boy from the stables. The house sat at the end of the path like something that had given up waiting long before she arrived. 3 stories of gray stone, windows dark on the upper floors, the front steps wearing a thin crust of last week's snow that no one had thought to clear. It was the 3rd week of November, 1887, and Harriet had been married for 6 hours. Her husband, Aldous Fenwick, had not made the journey with her. He had handed her into the carriage himself. That much she could say for him. He had stood on the steps of St. Andrew's Presbyterian in Halifax, still in his morning coat, and said, in a voice that was neither cruel nor particularly kind, that he had matters to attend to in the city, that the house was hers to settle into, that Mrs. Oakes, the housekeeper, would see to anything she needed. Then he had walked back up the church steps without turning around. Harriet had watched him go. She had not cried. There had not seemed to be much point. She was 24 years old, and she had known Aldous Fenwick for 11 weeks. Their introduction had been arranged by her father, who owed Aldous's family a debt that was not spoken of directly, but which everyone in the room had understood perfectly. Aldous was 38, a widower, and the owner of Fenwick Hall, a property outside Truro, Nova Scotia, that produced timber income and very little else of note. He was not unkind in conversation. He asked her once about the books she read, and seemed genuinely interested in her answer. She had allowed herself, in a weak moment, to think that might be enough. The carriage stopped. The driver, a man of about 50, who had not offered his name, climbed down and set her trunk on the bottom step with the practiced indifference of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. Harriet stepped out and looked up at the house. The front door opened before she reached it. A woman appeared in the frame, late 60s, black dress, white cap, the expression of someone who had learned long ago to manage her feelings about the things she was asked to manage. "Mrs. Fenwick," she said. "I am Mrs. Oakes. Welcome to Fenwick Hall." "Thank you," Harriet said. "I hope my trunk is not too heavy for the steps." Mrs. Oakes looked at her, just briefly, just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and Harriet understood that the woman had not expected that. She had expected something else. Tears, perhaps, or brittleness, or the particular kind of stiffness that well-bred young women used as armor. "I'll have William bring it in," Mrs. Oakes said. Inside the house was cold. Not unwelcoming in the way that some empty houses are cold. Not hostile, but simply unheated, the way a place gets when no one has thought to light fires in rooms that no one intends to use. The entrance hall was handsome enough. Dark wood paneling, a staircase of polished oak, a chandelier that held about half the candles it was designed for. But the air smelled of closed windows and disuse, and the table near the door held a vase of dried flowers that had been dried for rather too long. Harriet set her gloves on the table beside the vase. "How many are on staff?" she asked. Mrs. Oakes blinked. "Beg your pardon?" "Staff. How many people are currently employed at Fenwick Hall?" "There is myself," Mrs. Oakes said carefully. "William, who drives and manages the yard. Susanna in the kitchen. And Owen, who sees to the grounds. 4 people. For a house this size." Harriet nodded slowly. "I see. And the upper floors, are they in use?" "Mr. Fenwick uses his study and his bedroom on the 2nd floor when he is in residence. The rest." Mrs. Oakes paused. "The rest have been closed since Mrs. Fenwick passed. How long ago was that?" 4 years, ma'am." Harriet walked to the window, at the end of the hall. The garden beyond the glass was a tangle of overgrowth. What had once been a formal arrangement of paths and plantings swallowed now by 4 years of neglect. She could see the bones of it, though. The shape of what it had been. "I would like a fire lit in the study on the ground floor," she said, "and another in whatever bedroom you think most suitable for me. I will not use Mr. Fenwick's rooms until he is here to discuss the matter. I'll take supper at 7. Nothing elaborate, whatever Susanna has on hand." "Yes, ma'am." "And Mrs. Oakes." Harriet turned from the window. "I would like to see the household accounts in the morning. Whatever records exist, expenditures, maintenance logs, correspondence with any outside contractors. All of it." The housekeeper's expression shifted again. "The accounts. Yes. Mr. Fenwick handles the accounts from the city. Through Harrow and Associates, they manage the property. I wouldn't have." "Whatever you have on hand will do to start," Harriet said. "I don't need everything at once. Just what's here." She said it pleasantly. She had learned young that pleasantness was the most efficient tool available to a woman who wanted something. Mrs. Oakes said she would see what she could find. That night, Harriet sat alone at the long dining table, which was set at one end for a single person, and ate a supper of potato soup and cold roast that was, truthfully, better than she had expected. The fire in the corner had warmed the room considerably. Outside, the November dark had come down fast and complete, and the wind moved through the trees along the east side of the house, with a sound like breathing. She did not feel lonely, exactly. She felt aware of the silence, of the size of the house around her, of the fact that she was here and Aldous Fenwick was not, and that the arithmetic of her situation was something she was going to have to work out on her own. Her mother had wept at the wedding. Her father had shaken Aldous' hand with the relief of a man putting down something heavy. Her younger sister, Constance, had whispered to her in the vestibule beforehand, "You don't have to do this." And Harriet had squeezed her hand and said, "I know, that's why I am." She had meant it. She was not a martyr. She was a practical person who had looked at the available options and chosen the one with the most room to maneuver. The accounts, when Mrs. Oakes produced them the following morning, were a disaster. Not dramatic, not obviously criminal. Just the slow, grinding disaster of a property that had been managed at arm's length by people who had no particular reason to manage it well. Harriet spread the ledgers across the study desk and read through them with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. The numbers were maintained in a tidy enough hand. Harrow and Associates clearly employed competent bookkeepers. But the pattern that emerged across 3 years of records was one she recognized from her father's business, which she had helped him audit twice in her early 20s because he had trusted no one else. And she had had a talent for it. That neither of them discussed in company. The management fee paid to Harrow and Associates had increased by 32% over 3 years, with no corresponding increase in services rendered. 2 maintenance projects, re-roofing the east wing, resurfacing the drive, had been invoiced and paid for but showed, as far as Harriet could determine from the physical evidence around her, no signs of having actually occurred. The kitchen garden, for which a gardening contractor had been billing quarterly, was the same tangle of weeds she had seen from the window. She set down her pen and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she picked the pen back up and began to make notes. She did not write to Aldous, not yet. She needed more before she could make a case, and she understood instinctively that a case was what this would require. Not a complaint, not a wifely concern relayed over letter, but a documented argument that could not be dismissed. Instead, she wrote to the county property office in Truro, requesting copies of any permits filed for work at Fenwick Hall in the past 4 years. She wrote to the local supplier, whose name appeared on 2 of the maintenance invoices, asking for confirmation of the materials delivered. And she spent the better part of a rainy Thursday afternoon walking the east wing roof with Owen, the groundskeeper, a quiet man of about 60 who had clearly been waiting for someone to ask. "Were you here when the re-roofing was done?" she asked him. Owen looked at her steadily. "No crew came for the roof, Mrs. Fenwick. Not while I've been here." "How long is that?" 11 years. She nodded. "Thank you, Owen." "The garden," he said, before she could turn to go. He hesitated. "The garden was beautiful once. Before." "I can see that," she said. "We'll get to it." He looked at her the way Mrs. Oakes had looked at her in the hallway. That fractional pause, that recalibration, and went back to his work. Aldous arrived in December, on a Tuesday, without advance notice. Harriet was in the study when she heard his carriage. She finished the sentence she was writing, blotted the page, and went out to the hall to meet him. He looked tired. He was a tall man, lean in the way that suggested he forgot to eat when he was occupied with something, and he had dark eyes that moved quickly around the entrance hall as he handed his coat to Mrs. Oakes, taking in, she thought, the changes she had made. The candles replaced, the dried flowers removed, the hallway floor, which she had asked William to wax, reflecting the afternoon light for the first time in what was probably years. "Mrs. Fenwick," he said. A strange habit, using her formal address in his own house. Or perhaps not strange, perhaps simply careful. "Mr. Fenwick," she said, "I trust the journey was manageable well enough." He looked at her. "You've been busy." The house required some attention. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't expect you to trouble yourself with the house. What did you expect me to trouble myself with?" He didn't answer that. He asked instead about supper, and she told him it would be ready at 7, and they separated to their respective rooms with the polite efficiency of 2 people who did not yet know how to be in the same house. At supper, he asked about the study. "I was told you'd been using it," he said. "I hope that isn't an objection." "No." He looked down at his plate. "No, it's..." He stopped. "My wife used that room, my first wife." "Elspeth, I know," Harriet said. "Mrs. Oakes told me. I thought about choosing a different room, but the light is better there in the mornings, and I needed the light." Something moved across his face that she didn't have a word for yet. "What are you working on?" he asked. She had been deciding. since the moment she heard his carriage, how much to tell him. She had the evidence she needed, the county permits that confirmed no re-roofing work had been filed. The supplier's letter confirming materials had not been delivered to Fenwick Hall, her own careful comparison of the invoices against the physical state of the property. She had 3 months of meticulous documentation. She could tell him all of it now, or she could give him a door to open himself. "I've been reviewing the household accounts," she said. "I found some inconsistencies I'd like to discuss with you when you're ready." He looked up. What kind of inconsistencies? The kind that involve Harrow and Associates billing for work that does not appear to have taken place. She kept her voice level. "I've written to the county office and to 2 of the contractors named in the invoices. I have their responses. I think you'll want to read them." The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of a man who didn't believe her, but the silence of a man processing the distance between what he had assumed and what was apparently true. "How long has this been going on?" he said at last. "Based on what I can trace from the ledgers, at least 3 years, possibly longer, but the earlier records aren't here." "Who authorized?" He stopped. "I authorized the accounts. I signed off on the annual summaries Harrow sent me." "Yes," Harriet said. "I know." She said it without accusation. She meant it without accusation. She understood perfectly well how a man who was managing grief and a city business and a property he couldn't bear to visit might come to rely entirely on an agent he had trusted without verification for a decade. She understood it because it was exactly the kind of thing her father had done with his shipping contracts, and exactly the kind of thing she had quietly cleaned up for him before anyone else noticed. Aldous set down his fork. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't yet classify. Something between discomfort and something else, something closer to attention than she had seen from him before. "Show me," he said. She showed him. They spent 4 hours in the study that evening, going through everything she had assembled. He asked precise questions. She gave precise answers. At one point he stood up and walked to the window and stood there for a long moment with his back to her, looking out at the dark garden, and she let him stand there without filling the silence. When he turned around, he said, "I've been paying them for 4 years to manage this property, and they've been taking money for work they weren't doing." "Yes. Why didn't anyone tell me?" Harriet considered the question carefully. "Mrs. Oakes may not have known the specifics. Owen knew the roof work hadn't happened, but I imagine he assumed you had been told. In a house where the owner is absent and communication goes through a single agent, there are many things that simply—" She paused, choosing the word, "don't travel." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been here 3 months," he said. 11 weeks, she said. Something shifted in his face. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for the way I left you here, after the wedding." She had not expected that. She had prepared herself, over those 11 weeks, for a great many things. For indifference, for mild hostility, for the specific condescension of a man who had married below his expectation and knew it, but she had not particularly prepared herself for this. "You don't have to," she began. "I do," he said. "I know what this house looked like when you arrived. I know what it must have been to come here alone. I was not." He stopped. "I was not in a condition to be a husband to anyone. I am aware of that." "What condition were you in?" she asked. She meant it genuinely. He was quiet for a moment. "Elspeth died in this house. In the study, actually. She was taken ill very quickly at the end, and that was the room where she—" He stopped again. "I haven't been back here since the funeral because I did not want to be in a place where everything reminded me of her. And so I left it, and paid someone else to manage it, and did not look very closely at whether they were doing so. And then my solicitor told me I needed a wife for reasons that are legal," Harriet said. "The terms of your father's estate." He looked at her sharply. "Your solicitor told my father," she said. "My father told me. I preferred to know the actual reason." A pause. "Most women would have found that insulting. I found it clarifying," Harriet said. "I knew what I was agreeing to. I think that was fairer for both of us than a pretense of romance." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said quietly, "The garden. What about it? You said something to Owen about the garden." "He mentioned it," he said. Aldous paused. "He said you told him you'd get to it." "I intend to. It was Elspeth's garden. She designed it herself." "I know. Owen told me." He described what it looked like before. Harriet looked toward the window, though there was nothing to see but dark. "I thought, if you were amenable, it might be worth restoring. Not as a monument, just because it was well designed and the bones are still sound and it seems a waste to leave it." She heard him exhale. "I didn't know what to make of you," he said. It came out less guarded than anything else he'd said all evening. "When I read Mrs. Oakes's letters, She was. She was not subtle about the fact that you were different from what she expected. She expected someone who would require more managing. Yes, I was managing other things, Harriet said. And then, because the hour was late and the fire was low and she was tired of being measured by people's expectations of her. I didn't come here to be managed, Mr. Fenwick. I came here because this was the option available to me that left me the most room to be useful. I am aware that is not a conventional thing for a woman to say about her marriage. But I thought you might prefer the honesty. He was very still. I do prefer it, he said at last. In January, he sent a formal letter of termination to Harrow and Associates, and a separate letter to his solicitor outlining the grounds for a claim of breach of fiduciary duty. He had a different firm in Halifax review the full 4 years of accounts. Their findings were worse than Harriet had estimated, closer to $1,200 misappropriated in total, a significant portion of which was, in the end, recovered. He did not take credit for discovering it. In conversations with his solicitor, with the new management firm, with his business contacts in Halifax who inevitably asked, he said his wife had found it. He said it plainly, and without qualification, in a tone that did not invite further comment on the subject of whether it was unusual for a wife to be doing such things. The winter passed. He began to stay longer at Fenwick Hall than he had originally planned. A week became 2 weeks became a month. He started working from the downstairs library in the mornings rather than returning immediately to Halifax. They fell into a habit of breakfasting together, which neither of them had arranged deliberately, but which persisted because neither of them suggested stopping. He had a dry sense of humor that emerged slowly, like warmth from a fire you hadn't noticed being lit. He was interested in things, in the mechanics of how things worked, in the particulars of problems, in the same way she was, and conversations that began as practical discussions of the property would stretch on past supper before either of them noticed. He read after dinner. She read after dinner. Sometimes they read in the same room without speaking, which was, she thought, its own kind of intimacy. She was not naive about what it was and wasn't. She was not foolish enough to mistake his growing ease with her for something it might not be. But she noticed, in the small accumulating ways she noticed things, that he had begun to look at her differently than he had in November. Not with the careful, measured assessment of a man evaluating an arrangement, but with something less guarded. Something closer to actual curiosity. In March, she began restoring the garden. She worked with Owen, who turned out to have an encyclopedic knowledge of what had been planted there and where. They cleared the overgrowth in sections, working from the east path inward, salvaging what could be salvaged and removing what couldn't. She ordered seed from a catalog that Elspeth, apparently, had also used. She found the old orders in the house files, noted what had grown well, made her decisions accordingly. Aldous watched from the study window one afternoon, and she knew he was watching because she had learned the particular quality of the silence from that direction when he was there. She did not look up. She kept working. Later, he came out and stood at the edge of the cleared path with his hands in his coat pockets. "You found her seed catalogs," he said. "They were in the filing cabinet. I hope that's all right." He looked at the garden for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Grief, she thought, but grief that was no longer purely raw, something that had started, perhaps, to become memory rather than wound. "She would have liked you," he said. It seemed to cost him something to say it. "I think I would have liked her," Harriet said. "She had good instincts for a garden." He laughed. It surprised them both, a short, real sound that he seemed not to have been expecting from himself. He pressed his hand briefly to his jaw as if checking that it had happened. Then he said, "Have supper with me tonight." "Not in the dining room," I thought, "the library. It's warmer." "All right," she said. They had supper in the library, and then they talked until midnight, and she learned things about him she had not known. That he had grown up in this house and loved it, and then had not been able to come back to it, and that he had not known until she arrived how much it had needed someone to simply be present in it. That grief, for him, had looked like absence, removing himself from every place that reminded him of what he'd lost until there was very little left to occupy. "I gave you an empty house," he said. There was no performance in it. He said it the way a man says something he has been thinking about for a long time. "I walked away from it and left it for someone else to deal with, and that someone was you, and you were 24 years old, and I did not." He stopped. "I did not consider what that was asking of you. You couldn't have known what I would do with it." "No," he said. "But I should have tried to find out." She looked at him across the low table between them, the fire behind him, the house quiet around them both. This house that had been cold and dark when she arrived, and was neither of those things now, or at least less of them. Or at least was becoming less of them in the slow way that houses do when someone decides to care about them. I made a choice, she said. I chose to be here. I chose to find out what the house needed and to do something about it. You didn't ask me to do any of that. I know, he said. That's rather the point. She understood what he meant. She didn't say so, because it was late, and she was not sure yet what to do with the understanding. But she thought about it, later, in her room. In the room that had originally been the guest room, and that no one had suggested she change, and that she had not changed because she had not wanted to assume, and that she had quietly come to think of as hers in the way that spaces become yours, when you have spent enough time in them thinking your own thoughts. She thought. He came back. She thought, not because she had asked him to, not because the legal situation required his physical presence, not because there was anything to compel him here, except that, somehow, this cold and empty and rather sad house had become a place a person could want to return to. She had done that. She was allowed to notice that she had done that. In April, when the first things came up in the garden, the crocuses along the east path, a cluster of snowdrops near the stone wall that Owen had been watching for since February, Aldous came out in the morning without his coat and crouched down beside them and looked at them for a long time. She stood nearby and didn't say anything because nothing needed to be said. He reached out and touched one of the snowdrops very carefully, the way you touch something you thought was gone. Then he stood up and turned to her, and the look on his face was one she did not yet have a name for but thought in time she might. "Thank you," he said. Simply, plainly, the way he said things when he meant them without reservation. She thought of the woman who had stood on the church steps in Halifax 5 months ago, with her gloves folded in her hands, watching her husband walk away, and who had decided, in that moment, that walking away was not the thing she was going to do. "You're welcome," she said. And they went inside together into the warm house.